Okay, I think it's time to start. So let's begin with a meditation, and we'll continue with the same meditation as we did in the last session. So we'll practice the observing thoughts meditation. So remember here, the object of the practice is the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. So mental events includes thoughts, emotions, mental images, memories, and so forth. We're not focusing on sense objects, so just mental objects. Let your gaze be vacant. So again, just having the eyes open, either naturally or partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, and then observing thoughts without distraction and without grasping. So without allowing yourself to get caught up in any thoughts or emotions or images and so forth, and without grasping to them, simply observing them as they rise and pass. If we get caught up in any excitation or distraction, remember, first thing to do, relax, release grasping onto that thought, and then return to observe the mind. We can also add one more thing to this if we find ourselves getting caught up in excitation or distraction, and that is to lower the gaze. So if you notice any excitation, tension, distraction, lower the gaze a little bit, and that can bring the mind down a little bit. So experiment with that. Similarly, if we get caught up in laxity or dullness, then refresh interest in the practice, restore your attention on the object, and then retain the flow of mindfulness on the object. Here, of course, the mind. But also here, if you find yourself falling into dullness or drowsiness, you might like to experiment with elevating the gaze. So elevate the gaze, maybe even looking straight ahead if you find yourself getting very drowsy, particularly now after lunch, after having some lunch. And as we mentioned in the tips for the practice in the last session, if you find yourself constantly getting distracted, getting caught up in your thoughts and emotions and so forth, then try labeling or noting of thoughts. That is, whatever comes up, give it a name, but make sure you keep it simple. So if a thought comes up, just go thought. If some memory comes up, memory. Frustration, just frustration, image. Otherwise, if you don't make it too elaborate, because then it just becomes commentary on commentary on commentary. And in your labeling or noting, don't reference the content of the thought. For example, if you're getting angry or about someone or something, don't label angry about this such and such or frustrated about such and such. So leave out the content. Just give a name to the mental event, like image, memory, frustration, thought, so forth. So keep it simple. So you might like to experiment with that, because if you give a name to it, it makes it an object and then you have some space from it. So if you're getting, again, constantly distracted, you might like to experiment with that in this meditation. So let's do that same practice again as we did in the last session, adding this, shifting the gaze and the labeling to see if we can improve the quality of our practice. So finding a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. All the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in stillness. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass. Without following them, without trying to get rid of them. If you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up in thoughts and getting swept away, you might like to try labeling or noting. That is, give a name to the mental event, such as thought, image, frustration, memory, and so forth. And this way you can get some space from them and not so easily get caught up in them. And if you find yourself falling into dullness or drowsiness, then elevate your gaze and sharpen your focus, paying closer attention to the mind. And bringing the meditation to a close. We'll begin now with a short review of some of the earlier points from the previous session. And then we'll have a look at some stages of progress in this practice, shamatha practice, observing the mind, some more tips for this practice. Then we'll look at this actual practice again, add a little bit more to it. And we'll do the same practice observing thoughts, but in this case, paying close attention to actually emotions. And we'll give some instructions on that shortly. And then time for Q&A at the end. So we began with that earlier with that quote from Dujung Lingpa, that great 19th century Dzogchen master, that in the Dzogchen system of practice in Tibetan Buddhism, much emphasis is placed on the mind in shamatha and vipassana. So he says here, some cannot calm their thoughts because the mind is so agitated. Such people should relax and let thoughts be as they are, continually observing them with mindfulness and introspection. So once again, this word thought here is a more generic term meaning conceptual activity in general. So it includes not only thinking, but also emotions, memories, mental images, all mental activity. Thoughts in the breath practice, of course, were distractions. We need to let them go, but here, let them be, meaning thoughts are not distractions, just observe them with mindfulness and introspection. So therefore, not following thoughts, not trying to get rid of thoughts, not trying to make the mind still. And what came up earlier in an earlier session, but reiterating it here, is what is the difference between observing thoughts and mindfully thinking? These are not the same thing. If we're mindfully thinking about something, then we're focusing on the content of that thought. Whereas if we're observing a thought about something, we're observing the thought itself. So it's the difference between observing the thought, focusing on the thought, or the content of the thought. So here we're just observing the thought itself. Because if we're focusing on the content of the thought, we're caught up in the thought. And what we will notice in the initial stages of this practice, that a thought will come up, we'll latch onto it, and off we go. We just get caught up in one story after another. As we improve our ability to observe thoughts, then what's going to happen is instead of getting caught up and lost in our stories, we're going to be able to start to watch the story a little bit, meaning that we'll start to get caught up in the story and then we'll pull back out of it and we'll see it and we'll get caught up and pull back. And so we'll be able to sort of watch a story unfold, but there's still a story unfolding because we're getting still a little bit caught up in it. If we go further in our practice and release all grasping to thoughts, then there'll be no story. There'll be just some mental event will come up and it'll pass. There may be lots of mental events, but they won't have a thread. There won't be a story. They'll be just disjointed. So that's a very good sign that we're really releasing, grasping onto, identifying with and following thoughts. But these are already just in the initial stages. And then we talked about a little bit how thoughts really don't have any power to harm us from their own side. And so again, quoting here from Dujung Lingpa, he says, by just letting thoughts be, without having to do anything with them, all appearances lose their capacity to harm. So now what we do, of course, is if something unpleasant comes up, we either just get caught up in it or we try and suppress it. Then we're giving a lot of power to that thought to harm us. But if we don't have anything to do with it, we just watch it, then it has no capacity to harm. So that's what we mean by here, releasing thoughts, the release of thoughts. We're not talking about letting go of thoughts. We're talking about releasing the grasping to thoughts. the release of identifying with thoughts. So just let thoughts be, meaning simply recognizing thoughts as thoughts. Therefore, they have no capacity to harm us whatsoever. If we identify with thoughts, if we get caught up in thoughts, then of course we'll try and suppress them. Then we give a lot of power to thoughts to harm us. Then they can really inflict a lot of harm on us. And so here in this practice, we can talk about the stages of release of thoughts. And this comes from the Buddhist texts, the first one is called naked release, meaning that simply when we recognize a thought as a thought, then it's released, meaning it has no power to harm us. Releasing doesn't mean we're getting rid of it. Release means it's liberated. It's just an appearance. So that's what it means by naked release, that we see it nakedly. We recognize it as a thought. Then it's released. It has no power to do anything to us. And if we keep doing that, and of course, initially it'll come up, we'll start to get caught up in it, and then we'll see it as a thought, and then it's released. But as we go deeper and further into this practice and we become more familiar with observing thoughts, then soon as a thought appears, we can release it. Previously, I mean, now as a beginner, of course, it comes up, we follow it, a long story. But then we start to do this practice and we go through this naked release where it comes up, we start to get a little bit caught up, then we see it as a thought and then it's released. But then if we keep doing that, then as we get more familiar with this, as soon as a thought appears, we can release it. And the analogy here is given that thoughts release themselves like a snake unraveling itself. And then if we go much further into the practice, go deeper into the practice and become extremely familiar with this, then we have what's called self-release, meaning that we always see thoughts as thoughts. They're just appearances. We know that for a fact through the familiarity of observing them. So then self-release is when there's no way that thoughts can harm you. And the analogy given here in the text is like a thief who comes to an empty house. There's nothing to steal. And it's because we're so familiar with this that we have released or grasping to thoughts, then there is no way a thought can harm us. And this is called self-release. So these are some of the stages that we'll go through in this practice. And then there's a couple of models that are used to describe the stages of progress in shamatha practice. So in the previous retreat, where we looked at mindfulness of breathing, then we used the classic 9-stage model, that color diagram and the chart. And so that is really a classic 9-stage model to describe the stages of progress in shamatha practice, particularly when we're using an object such as the breath. And these 9 stages are called the 9 mental abidings, that we're abiding better and better on the object. And so that is the classic model that we use there. We only looked at the first 4 stages in that retreat. And so what we'll do tomorrow is we'll review those 4 stages and then we'll complete that chart in, I think, the 3rd session tomorrow. Here in the shamatha practice of observing the mind, then we often, or more often in the text, rather than the 9-stage model, a 4-stage model is used, the one that's described here on this slide. Because in this practice, the breath practice, our perspective is the mind perspective, the mind abiding better and better on the object. Whereas here in this practice, it's really much more about the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the mind? And there are 4 stages that we go through. Is that when we start to observe the mind, at the first stage of practice, what we notice is a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on us, one after the other, non-stop. And so that is the analogy used to describe what's going on in the mind when we start this practice. And if we keep watching and not so much get caught up in those thoughts and be able to start to release them, then instead of a cascading waterfall of thoughts crashing down on us, the amount of mental content will slow down a little bit. So then instead of a waterfall of thoughts at the next stage of progress, what we'll notice, it's more like a fast flowing river of thoughts. So there's still quite a lot of mental activity going on, but not as much as before. And we're able to more passively observe it without getting swept up in it. And then if we keep watching and not feeding, that the next stage of progress, at the third stage, then the amount of mental content will slow down even more, and we'll start to notice bigger and bigger gaps between when one thought stops and the next thought starts. And so then it'll be, at the third stage, it'll be more like a slow moving river of thoughts. And then if we keep watching, then the amount of mental activity will subside even more. And eventually the mind will become completely still and quiet. And so the analogy here is then that slow moving river of thoughts will empty into a still lake or an ocean. So this is a classic 4-stage model that's used to describe the stages of progress in this shamatha practice. And in that chart that we looked at in the last retreat, which we'll look again tomorrow, these two models, the 9-stage model and 4-stage model, are sort of correlated, are put together. And we see very briefly here the correlations between these 4 stages and the 9 stages in the other chart. And we will look a little bit more detail at those correlations in tomorrow's sessions. So the last point here is, in this practice, we, again, even though at the higher end of this practice, the mind will become still, we're not trying to make the mind still. In fact, particularly as a beginner, it can be helpful to have thoughts, because then we've got something to observe. Because the big danger as a beginner is that if there are no thoughts and the mind goes still, we just end up in this sort of spaced out, dull, drowsy state, and we won't go anywhere. Where at least if there's thoughts there, it challenges us to observe it. And that can really help improve stability and clarity of attention. So this is the sort of classic model that's used in this program, in this shamatha practice. Just a few more tips for the practice before we go back to the practice. And for this, I'd like to read a little bit from Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace regarding this practice, which he calls settling the mind in its natural state, this practice of observing the space of the mind and all the mental events that arise in that space. So let's see what he says on page 101. He says the following: when you first begin the practice of settling the mind in its natural state, you may have difficulty identifying the intangible domain of the mind. Or even if you do settle your awareness there, after some time, your attention may become vague, disoriented, or spaced out. If you have difficulty identifying the domain of the mind or sustaining your attention there, consciously bring up a thought such as, "What is the mind?" and attend to it. Don't think about this question or try to answer it. Just observe the thought itself, watching it emerge in the field of consciousness and then dissolve back into that space. Once it's gone, keep your focus right where the thought was and see what comes up next. If you slip back into a kind of lax, mindless vacuity, deliberately generate the thought again and observe it with bare attention. When you become familiar with this practice, you will no longer need to generate such a thought to crystallize your awareness and locate your attention. That will happen by itself as thoughts arise and pass of their own accord. So as we mentioned earlier, generating thoughts is not part of the standard practice. However, if we're a beginner and we don't know where to focus to be able to have some focus, then we can bring this in. Or if we're not able to observe thoughts at all, we're just getting swept up all the time, and we're getting disheartened thinking, well, I can't do this practice at all, then we can do this. We can deliberately generate thoughts every now and again to help us to get into the practice. If you're generating a thought, don't make it emotionally charged thought, because you'll get caught up in it. So something that's sort of very bland thought. And then just watch that thought as it arises in your mind. And when it disappears into the mind again, just keep your attention right where it was and see what comes up next in that space. So this generating thoughts, again, is just a temporary short-term strategy that you may find helpful to get into the practice. And then a few more points. He goes on to say, the practice of attending to the space of the mind and whatever events arise there is like taking a naturalist's field trip into the wilderness of your mind. When you first embark on this inward journey, you may perceive very little, but as you grow more and more accustomed to the practice, you will begin to identify an increasing quantity and range of mental phenomena. Some of them are discrete, like thoughts and images, while others are nebulous, like emotions and moods. And we'll talk about that difference shortly. This practice provides you with experiential access to a domain that cannot be observed with any of the instruments of modern science or technology. The most they can do is detect the neural and behavioral correlates of the phenomena you are observing directly. You have become a naturalist of the mind, and a whole new world is opening up to you that for most people remains largely unconscious. And so we can talk about conscious versus subconscious, and we can talk about a threshold. And now we are only aware of the mental events above that threshold. And there's a lot of mental activity going on at a deeper level that we're not aware of. If we do this shamatha practice and improve our relaxation, stability, clarity, our attention skills, that threshold will dramatically go down, and we'll start to pick up more and more subtle mental events that now we don't notice. And this is what he says in the next paragraph. He says, in this practice, the locus of awareness gradually descends from the superficial level of coarse mental activity that is immediately accessible through introspection down into the inner recesses of the mind that are normally below the threshold of consciousness. You discover in this training that the border between conscious and unconscious mental events shifts in relation to the degrees of relaxation, stability, and clarity of attention. Especially when you engage in this practice for many hours each day, for days, weeks, or months at a time, you dredge the depths of your own psyche. In doing so, you remember long forgotten experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, and a wide range of desires and emotions. What happens here is a kind of luminously clear discerning, free association of thoughts, mental images, memories, desires, fantasies, and emotions. You are plumbing the depths of your own mind, undistracted by external diversions. Once hidden phenomena are unmasked through the lack of suppression of whatever comes up. This is potentially an extraordinarily deep kind of therapy. We saw about that, the healing capacity of the mind. And he says, and the more intensively you practice it, the more important it is to proceed under the guidance of an experienced, compassionate teacher. During your meditation sessions, internalize the wisdom of this contemplative tradition and make sure you implement the core instructions of this practice, which are, whatever arises in the mind, do not be carried away by it and do not grasp onto or identify with it. Just let it be. Watch thoughts, feelings, or other mental events arise. With discerning intelligence, be aware of their nature and let them slip back into the space of awareness without any judgment or intervention on your part. This is the key to letting the knots of the psyche unravel themselves as the extraordinary healing capacity of the mind reveals itself. This is the path to deep sanity. One point relating to what he just said is this is a shamatha practice. So the goal of this practice is to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind, to develop single-pointed concentration. So whatever comes up in the mind here, then just observe it. So therefore, we're not trying to figure out anything. So if something comes up, we're not trying to figure out where did that come from, why is it there, what's going on. That is later in Vipassana practice. We ask those sorts of questions. But here in shamatha, we simply observe whatever is arising in the mind. We're not trying to figure out anything at all. We're just observing. The goal is, again, is developing single-pointed concentration. So therefore, we have these three short-term strategies mentioned here to help us to get into the practice. The first one is, again, if we don't know where to focus at all or we're completely lost, every now and again generate a thought to help us to get into the practice. If we can get into the practice, but we're getting swept away a lot by our thoughts and emotions and so forth, you might like to introduce a little bit of labeling or noting of the thoughts to not get caught up. But again, keep it simple and just label and note the event itself. Don't, in the labeling or noting the content of the mental event, don't add that to the label or note. And one other thing that you can experiment with in this meditation, you may find even more helpful to get into the practice, and that is anchoring yourself in the breath. If again you're getting caught up and swept away all the time, and you're finding labeling and noting really doesn't work very well or doesn't help, then do this. Again, if you're getting swept up a lot constantly, then anchor yourself in the breath. Go back into the body and focus on the breath, particularly the variation of the breath practice that we introduced earlier today, and that is the rhythm of the breath is very good as an anchor. So just focus on the rhythm of the breath. So initially, you may actually focus on the rhythm of the breath 100%. Give all your attention to the rhythm of the breath for a few minutes to calm the mind, to stabilize the mind. Then what you can do is still mainly focus on the rhythm of the breath, and then a little bit in the corner of the mind, notice any thoughts that may be arising. But the main focus is still the breath. So that way you're anchoring yourself in the breath. Then once you can manage to do that and not get swept away, shift the focus more, meaning shift more to focusing on the thoughts, but a little bit still in the corner of the mind, you're anchoring yourself in the rhythm of the breath. And then eventually, once you can do that, eventually you can let go of the breath altogether and just observe the thoughts. So this is a way of getting into the practice to avoid getting swept away, going through this transition from the breath, more, less, and then thoughts, and eventually all thoughts. So you might like to experiment with that also in this meditation. One more tips for the practice, and then we'll go into the practice again. And there was a question came up about this in the earlier session, and that is in this practice to let your gaze be vacant. And so remember the benefits of having the eyes open in this practice, either partially or naturally. It helps improve clarity of attention, less likely to be dull, helps us to be more in the present moment, avoiding jumping off into the past and future, helps to break down that false sense of duality. So because it's not such a strong sense of me in here and a world out there if the eyes are open. With the eyes closed, there's really a strong sense of duality. And then also it helps us to transition into daily life, because we want to be able to observe thoughts and emotions in daily life without getting caught up. But if we only meditate with eyes closed, then generally in daily life we have our eyes open. We're not used to observing thoughts with eyes open. It's going to be much more difficult to do that. Now, the reality is that for many people, the visual sense dominates means it remains active. So even though with the instruction to let your gaze be vacant, we're not looking at anything, because for many of us, the visual gaze dominates, it will still be active, and then you'll start looking around everywhere at lots of things. So therefore, there's a few things we can do. One is to have a softly lit room, so quite an even completely dark room. I personally like to meditate in a completely dark room. So if you've got a completely dark room with your eyes open, then there's nothing for the visual gaze to lock onto. At least not to have any movement in the visual field. So if you've got some flickering candle or something moving, of course, that's going to attract the attention. Ideally then, not only having nothing moving in the visual field in front of you, maybe have a blank wall. So there's nothing really to attract the attention. If you're in a situation where this is not possible, maybe you're, for example, in a group situation, in a group retreat, and there's people in front of you and they're moving, and of course that's going to attract your attention, then what you can do is pick a point. And I think there's a person mentioned that in they were focusing on a single, I think a small Buddha, but you can pick a point in front of you and lock your visual gaze onto that. Again, this is not really part of the practice, but it's better to have that single point rather than the visual gaze going all over the place. Another thing you can try is to use a sleeping mask, one of those contoured ones that don't press on the eyes. Then you can have that on, you can have your eyes open and it's completely dark. And so there's nothing to lock your attention on. I like to use that, particularly when I'm in environments where there is a lot of movement going on, if I'm traveling and so forth. And of course, the last thing is to be patient, because we're cultivating a new habit here and it'll take time to cultivate that. And then the other thing with the gaze, as we already introduced earlier, is that if we're falling into dullness or laxity, you might like to elevate the gaze. That can brighten the attention. Or if the mind is getting tense or agitated or even distracted, then lower the gaze and that can really have an effect on the laxity and excitation. So you might like to experiment with the lowering and elevating of the gaze. So we'll go back to the practice now. And this practice, often in this practice, there is a number of analogies used to describe this practice. One is, a classic is that the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like the clouds moving through the sky. Another analogy is the mind is like an ocean and the thoughts are like the waves on the ocean. Or the mind is like a stage and the actors and the thoughts are like actors on the stage. So we have this idea of foreground and background, that the background is the mind or the space of the mind, and then the foreground is all the mental events that arise in that space. But those mental events that arise in that space, as I think as Alan Wallace mentioned, can be sort of more objective in nature or more subjective in nature. The more objective in nature mental events are the more discrete things like thoughts, memories, mental images. The more subjective mental events are things like desires, emotions, mental afflictions, which often come in the form of reactions to the objective mental events. And the reason I'm introducing this here now, this distinction, is that the objective mental events are more discrete and they're more easy to observe. The subjective mental events tend to be more nebulous and they're more close to us, they're more sticky. And so they're often harder to notice and we miss out seeing them. For example, we may be observing the mind and there's nothing much there and we're getting frustrated, but we don't notice the frustration because it's a more subjective mental event. So therefore, we can talk about three aspects in this practice. The background, the space of the mind, and the foreground is the objective mental events and the subjective mental events. So what I'd like to do in this meditation now is again, observe the mental events, but here in this practice, particularly emphasizing the subjective mental events because we tend to miss them. So particularly any sorts of reactions to things that are coming up in the mind, any craving, any frustration, any aversion, anything like that. So paying very close attention to these subjective mental events. And so the instructions, apart from that, are the same, without distraction and without grasping, playing around with the elevating, lowering gaze if you find that helpful. And again, if you find yourself constantly getting caught up in your thoughts and emotions, then experiment with labeling or noting, or experiment with anchoring in the breath, particularly the rhythm of the breath, to give yourself some space to avoid that heavy distraction. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's do that practice again. If you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. As usual, we begin by preparing the body, keeping the back nice and straight, and allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. In particular, letting go of any expectations for this practice. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Observing thoughts, emotions, and other mental events as they arise and pass, without following them, without grasping to them. keeping both the body and the mind completely relaxed, releasing any tension on the out-breath. And in this session, in particular, paying very close attention to the more subjective mental events, such as desires, emotions, mental afflictions. And in particular, any reactions to anything pleasant or unpleasant that appears. And we can bring the meditation to a close. We've got time for some question answer now. So if there's any questions, either through the chat or switch on the mic and webcam and ask away. Yes, Pamela.
Yeah, hi, Glenn. I
Hi.
really found helpful what you said earlier about the difference between observing a thought and mindful thinking. I wonder if you could say something about the difference between mindful thinking and mindless thinking, because I assume it's a continuum rather than a clear division. So, you know, experientially, how do you know where you are?
Well, it's who's in control, basically. Mindful thinking, you're in control. Mindless thinking, your mind is in control. It's taking you all over the place. Whereas if it's mindful thinking, you are deciding to think about this and this and this. So you're in control. So mindless thinking is never any use. Mindful thinking, of course, is necessary if we want to think about something. So yeah, so it's basically who's in control.
I see. So it's not a case of it stop start, that you get lost a bit and come back, and lost a bit and come back.
Well, you will. I mean, obviously, if we're in some work environment or something, we're thinking about something, then often we get distracted by something, don't we? Come back. If we're trying to focus on some task at work or something, then we're mindfully thinking about the problem or whatever. But then somehow a thought about dinner comes up and off we go and think about the things we got to do. Oh, no, come back. So yes, and of course, that mindless thinking means our mindful thinking is much less effective. So we have much less effectiveness in work or in anything we focus on. And so this sort of practice, even though we're not mindfully thinking, we're observing thoughts, but we are developing the ability to be the masters of our mind, which translates into daily life. We can do much better, much more effective mindful thinking and much less mindless distraction, mindless thinking. So this practice will help us to be more mindfully thinking in daily life.
Yeah, thank you. That's much clearer. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So is a chat question or?
There is a chat question from Helga.
Okay.
She's asking, in a dark room, there are no visual triggers. What is the benefit as opposed to having one's eyes closed?
The benefit is that you still have the eyes open. So psychologically, there is still this, with the eyes closed, it's closed and there's this sense of in and out. Whereas with the eyes open in a dark room, we still have not this strong sense of in and out. And also, it's another thing is to do with the mental association, is that generally eyes closed means sleep. And so if we meditate with eyes closed, our mental association, our mind says, okay, it's time to sleep. Whereas eyes open generally is not a mental association to sleep. So even though it's dark, we still have the eyes open, and that strong association is not there with sleep with eyes closed. So this, I think there is a qualitative difference between meditating with eyes closed or meditating with eyes open in a dark room. Any other questions?
Glenn, hi, this is Daniel from Copenhagen.
Daniel, yes?
I just wanted to ask in relation to one of the points that you mentioned earlier about some of the kind of ultimate goals of this practice, bringing about this idea of the thoughts being some sort of an illusion. in the later stages, you said that when we kind of disassociate with these thoughts, we release much quicker. And
right, we want to be careful with terms here. We're not disassociating. That's pathological.
Yeah.
That's
So I just wanted to understand actually what you meant by this, because it seemed to me somehow to be quite similar to this idea of spiritual bypassing. And
yeah, so we're not talking about disassociation. I mean, this is pathological. So the release of thoughts means simply not to get caught up in grasping to thoughts. So now we are stuck in two extremes. Either we grasp, identify, follow, or if we don't know what to do with it, we suppress, or in other words, you could say disassociate. So that is the other extreme. So what we are doing here is finding the middle way between those two extremes of getting caught up and disassociation. And so the release of thoughts is releasing the grasping. So it's that extreme, but the release doesn't mean suppress. By releasing grasping, we are still fully present with the thought. So we're not disassociating or suppressing. So releasing doesn't mean to get rid of the thought. It means to release identifying or grasping onto the thought. Does that make sense?
All right, that makes sense, yeah. And then
Sure.
I wanted to actually follow up on that question with another question about should we actually be ultimately aiming to bring this practice of observing the mind into our daily lives as we go about ordinary daily activities, or is there a way to kind of...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. As I mentioned in the shamatha training, in fact, in any practice, there's always two parts to a practice. There's meditation and what we do for the rest of the day. If we don't bring the meditation into the day, we're not going to progress in any practice. So if we do this practice diligently every morning, observing our thoughts for 30 minutes every morning, but then we jump up and run around and get caught up in our thoughts the rest of the day, I mean, how much progress are we going to make? Not much. Whereas if we do the 30 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever we do of watching thoughts in the morning, that's preparing ourselves for the day and starting to develop that habit. Then through the day, we bring that into daily life by, as we were talking with Pamela there, the mindfully thinking and things like that, and witnessing thoughts and so forth. And so if we bring that activity into daily life, then that's going to feed back into the meditation, so they'll work together. So if we really want any practice to be effective and progress, then we need to have these two aspects: meditation, where we internalize, and then post-meditation, where we integrate into daily life. And how we integrate, we'll look at a little bit in the last session tomorrow.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure, okay. If there's one last question, otherwise we'll take a break there. Okay, let's take a break, another 30-minute break. And in the next session, we're going to, well, first we'll begin with another practice of observing the mind, and I'll make a few more comments about that practice, and then we'll do that. But then in the next session, we'll look at the second of the two main practices in this weekend retreat. That is the resting in awareness shamatha practice. So we'll be looking at that in the next session. So 30-minute break, and we'll begin again then. So see you in 30 minutes.